Good morning, everyone. And thank you all for joining us this morning. Now, we're here to discuss the First Step Act, which is a bipartisan criminal justice reform bill that the president signed in December, and that most people agree really represents the most sweeping change in a generation to our nation's federal prison and sentencing laws. Matthew, I'd like to start with you because you're the first person released under the First Step Act. Could you explain to us what aspect of the law applied to your case and how it's impacted you personally in your community?
The aspect of the First Step Act that applied to me was the fact that it made retroactive the changes that were made to the 2010 sentencing guidelines by the Obama administration. They were not made retroactive at the time, so you had two classifications of inmates, those sentenced pre-2010 and those sentenced post. So therefore, I was caught up in the pre-situation, and because it wasn't made retroactive, I still had to have the sentence that was based on the racial disparity that caused them to actually change it post-2010.
So how has it impacted your life? I mean, you're free.
What has impacted me?
Doesn't get better than that, right?
Exactly. The main way it impacted me was the fact that I'm free, and that over 3,000 other inmates have the opportunity to be set free as well. That is clearly, everybody has stated that it was based on racial disparity, so now they get a chance to have their sentences reviewed and released.
DeAnna, your organization did not support the First Step Act. Could you talk to us about your reservations, and then now that it has become law, what do you hope it will achieve?
So I want to start by, whenever there's a bill, there's certain aspects to a bill. So definitely the fair sentencing retroactive was a part that we did support. What we could not support, being an organization that's focused on half by 2030, decarcerating the U.S. correctional population, was portions of it around the earned credit. So one thing, First Step Act went totally against best practices. It actually evidence did not drive the policy.
How so?
So in the EARN Act, it specifically says that access is allowed to low-risk individuals.
Nonviolent offenders.
Not nonviolent, low risk. And that was a misconception because people tendency to think risk and crime go together, and they don't. I can be an individual who has committed a crime, never been incarcerated, commit murder, and actually score low risk on a risk assessment tool. So let's talk about the low risk, the evidence-based practice of it. Research shows, and being a person who managed the Second Chance portfolio, research shows that any recidivism reduction program should go to those most at risk of recidivating. It actually says when you give individuals who are low risk programming, you actually have a propensity to increase their recidivism rate. So that was the first part. Individuals, when you said low risk individuals qualify for this earned time credit to be able to get out on e-incarceration, historically, African Americans, based on how our communities are policed, based on how our schools have more school resource officers than guidance counselor, the static portions of a risk assessment ask questions I'll never be able to change in my life. So I can never change the fact that I have a PhD today, but I didn't graduate high school. I'll never be able to change the fact of my first interaction with law enforcement and how old I was. I'll never be able to change the fact of how many probation violations I have. Those are the static dynamics of a risk assessment before you get to the institutional behavior to see where a person is. So historically, based on historical stop and frisk, racial profiling, African Americans and Latinos actually have a higher risk of their interaction with law enforcement. So based on that portion, we were already screened out. Not only were we screened out, you started carving out the crimes. And I think the most part that I got totally upset was the retroactive of the crack to cocaine disparity was one. But the actual casualties of the war on drugs, let's be honest, the 1994 crime bill was a bipartisan criminal justice bill at that time that had unintended consequences that resulted in mass incarceration. So this wasn't nothing new, but it was being perpetrated as it was. So when we really look at, we weren't decarcerating. To put people on e-carceration means we are actually expanding the carceral state into our communities. So an affluent community may not be over-policed because you may have one person in your community. we can end up with 15 people in a marginalized, disadvantaged community on e-carceration. And let's be honest, when you're on e-carceration, you're still under the custody of the correctional system.
Let's bring Pat in here.
Yeah.
Pat, do you share any of these concerns? It's interesting. Now, your organization, which is conservative, it might surprise some people to hear that you supported the Next Step Act. So where do you think it's going to make a difference first? And did you share some of these same concerns that DeAnna's organization did?
Well, I don't compromise on principle. I do on strategy. And the fact of the matter is, the perfect is the enemy of the good. If we'd waited for a perfect bill, Matthew would still be incarcerated, and he'd be incarcerated for 11 more years. So I don't know how it's in the interest of communities to continue to incarcerate a man like Matthew. And there's an old saying, half a loaf is better than none. And just from the very name of the legislation, the First Step Act, it shows it's our intent to continue. But you've got to start somewhere. And this was a major step forward in changing the view of offenders from a burden on society to potentially contributors to society. And this is intended to stop the warehousing of individuals and instead prepare them so they can be good parents, good neighbors, good tax-paying citizens. Somebody that's unemployed because of their offense doesn't have much chance of making it. And this is intended to help them make it. You say it's unusual for conservatives. I would strongly disagree. I've been working for these reforms for over 20 years, 22 years to be exact. And when I came out of prison, I'd been very active politically. Among my peers, they were as upset about the overuse of incarceration as my liberal friends, but they brought a lot more to the table. They brought credibility so that people like Newt Gingrich, Grover Norquist, Ken Cuccinelli, former AG of Virginia, Hal Stratton, the former AG of New Mexico, said this is wrong. Government, through the incarceration system, is able to deny people total control of their lives because some obscure law says that they're evil, not because the act is inherently evil, but because they've broken the law. Not necessarily harmed anybody, but they've broken the law. We take them from their home, from their communities, from their church, from their work, and we lock them up with no control over their life. They can't choose when to get up, what to do with their time all day, when to eat, what to eat. They're restricting their ability to worship God. All those things the government has the authority to do, but it should be used rarely. Instead, we overuse it.
There were conservative senators, though, who tried to block this and who did
Well,
think
but
it would decrease safety in the United States.
They were definitely the aberrants, okay? Tom Cotton and John Kennedy. But on the other hand, you had Mike Lee, Rand Paul, Lindsey Graham, all pushing hard for this. Again, I mentioned I've been at this 22 years. The first issue I was involved in was the right of people to practice their faith in prison. Harry Reid was trying to strip prisoners of the protection of the First Amendment. And, we recruited Ted Kennedy and John Ashcroft to join together to fight
An
this.
unlikely pairing.
Yes, but it won. And just like on this, we had Dick Durbin and Chuck Grassley. This issue unites people.
Let's go to Matthew. Matthew, again, you obviously benefited immensely from this law, but you also submitted an op-ed to the Washington Post over the last month saying you'd like to see more changes. So what do you think was not included that should have been?
The fact that there are still a lot of people that's over-sentenced that the First Step Act will not reach.
What do you mean over-sentenced?
In other words, because, as she was just stating, back in when the Criminal Justice Act came out, it over-sentenced people because it overreacted. And now those changes are being made to correct those things that were done at that time. So there's still a lot of people in there, or when I say in there, are in prison that have sentences that exceed what is probably based on the crime that they actually committed. So therefore, for those people to have their sentence reviewed, and for those that have been incarcerated for a particular period of time that exceed 15 years, to be able to have a way to have their sentences reviewed, because as Mr. Nolan has stated, people change. People are going to be released back into society. And the disagreement, I really don't want to call it a disagreement, that I have with what was said a little bit earlier as far as the First Step Back is like, didn't do enough. We know that it didn't do enough. We know that there's more that's going to need to be done, but no action instead of some action and then fighting for more action just doesn't make logical sense to me.
And
DeAnna, okay, go ahead.
And I totally want to follow up on that, because we weren't saying throw the whole bathtub out. We were saying any portions that continue to entrench the structural racism that the system was built on, we don't want to entrench any more harm. We want to keep moving indefinitely the portions. Someone asked me if there were certain things in this bill that you would have to say, okay, I have to support it. I have to be with Matthew. The Fair Sentencing Act was retro in this bill, but when life was changed to 25 years, and in most states it's 20, it wasn't retroactive. The stacking provisions moving forward, had those been retroactive, I would have had to say, you know what? There are so many individuals who were impacted by the war on drugs that are going to be released now who have 50-year sentences. But those individuals, like Matthew said, aren't being impacted at all. To me, it didn't rectify any of the harms that had been previously done on that portion. But definitely never throw out the whole bathtub, but just make sure whatever bill we're pushing is not entrenching any more harms to a certain population.
Yeah, DeAnna, I was wondering, do you and Pat, both of you do work at the local levels and state level a good bit. Do you think that's where some of the future solutions are going to be evolving? I mean, that clearly is where the majority of our incarcerated inmates are, some 91%.
It actually has to be where it happens. What we want to make sure of is that whatever we saw within the First Step Act that has the potential to entrench harms or didn't have a far enough reach, that as we move into the states, we make sure those things are course corrected.
Anything you see in particular that you like that should be in a Second Step Act?
Not yet.
No, yeah? Okay, Pat.
No, I know Florida is starting to, I haven't seen their bill and their proposal at this time.
Well, actually, this started in the States. We've been active in the States for years. Tough on Crime, Texas, changed their laws. They've been able to, they basically reserve prison space for people that are a danger to society, and they correct the actions of others through community placement so they can stay with their families. That freed up money that could increase mental health services, increase drug treatment, and job placement. They've been able to close 8 prisons. And the most important things to conservatives is we've been able to do that while reducing crime to the lowest point since 1967. That doesn't happen by accident. It makes but intelligent choices, not over-incarcerating, but choosing incarceration for those that pose an actual threat, while instead dealing with people that we're just angry with in the community. And that has been the formula in South Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Utah, Alaska, North Dakota. So it's already happening at the state level. Now, the passage of the First Step Act has shown that left and right can work together.
Right, so it can motivate change where it hasn't
it's
happened
already,
yet on the local
right,
level.
as you said, 90% are in state prisons. That's where we're really going to change the overuse of incarceration.
Matthew.
I just wanted to add the fact that the First Step Act also made it able for judges to utilize discretion in their own courtrooms. When I was incarcerated for those 22 years, 21 and a half before I was released, then went back for 7 months. The fact that the sentencing sentences were mandatory when I came in because the United States guidelines were mandatory. They were changed to advisory, but again, it wasn't made retroactive, so it didn't affect me.
There was no judicial discretion.
That's correct. So in 1998, in 2000, and 2010, the laws were changed that indirectly affected me, but didn't directly affect me because they had no benefit of releasing me. However, those laws were changed. And because they were changed, people were saying, okay, this is wrong, we need to fix it. Now, us that were incarcerated, and I can speak because I've done 22 years, us who are incarcerated didn't say, well, you're fixing it for them, but what about us? No, we're happy that you're getting it right. To me, the First Step Act gets it right in the sense that it is doing something to help those that are now coming in. And the fact that the judge now has the discretion to give somebody alternative sentencing, whether they need treatment, mental illness help, instead of incarceration, as opposed to saying, I have to sentence you to just based on the sentencing guidelines. To me, that was a win in all directions as well.
Now, before we go to audience for questions, DeAnna and Pat, I wanted to ask you, because I know this is really personal for everyone here. You've all done some time. Are you optimistic as we look down the road that more reforms will come? And what most worries you in the way of roadblocks? I know some are concerned about our current Attorney General, who, when he was in the same role in the 90s, was really the architect of the get tough on crime philosophy that led to mass incarceration in the United States.
I think I'm definitely optimistic. I think one of the things that we have to address that we continue to sweep under the rug is this nonviolent versus violent scenario and what actually equals violence, especially when we know most perpetrators of violence at one time were a victim, a witness, and then a perpetrator. And when people actually identify where violence took place, it normally starts in their home, their neighborhood, their school, then prison. And traditionally, when we look at how people are charged, again, and I'm going to keep sticking with this structural racism part of it, because in certain communities, charges are stacked and done in a different way that equals a violent tendency that truly may not have been an act of violence at all. And in America, we convict based on a charge, and we don't take a lot of the individual trauma and things that have taken place. I think Tony talked about that being here. So for me, I'm definitely optimistic, but we as a society maybe have to stop talking about criminal justice and talk about social justice and restoring human dignity inside individuals so we can get rid of this narrative of who's deserving and who's not.
Pat.
Yeah. Well, we believe that people do bad things and need to be held accountable. There are some people that pose a great danger. I agree, we've over-defined violence to where a lot of things none of us would consider violent are classified as that. But there are people that we're legitimately afraid of. I grew up, one of my dance partners as a kid was Squeaky Fromme, one of Charles Manson's folks. Okay, that's truly frightening. She was a danger to society, all right? So we think we need prisons, we just way overuse it. And we think the sentence for a crime should never do more harm than the underlying act. And so many of our sentences do more harm than whatever was done that was wrong. So we are optimistic. I think our biggest danger with the First Step Act is the bureaucracy just refuses to let go of folks.
Talking Federal Bureau of Prisons?
Right,
Department
the Federal
Justice?
Bureau of
Okay.
Prisons. We had a provision in there that defined what Congress had always said, that good time credit was 57 days a year. 54, sorry. The BOP arbitrarily said it's 47. So Congress said, hey, you're cheating these folks out of 7 days per year. If you've done a 10-year stretch, that's 70 days. That's real time. And the BOP has said, well, yes, it changed the law, but we have 120 days in which to implement it. Well, hell, that should everybody under that provision was cheated out of that time. Why weren't they immediately released? What's the interest of the BOP in holding people longer than Congress said they should be held? So one thing to understand, I'm a conservative. I fought against mindless bureaucracies my whole life. And to understand prisons, take a DMV office, string barbed wire around it, and give the clerks guns.
Ooh.
Yep.
Well, on that note, let's go to questions. All right, we got one back here.
Hi, my name is Nancy Trevino. I'm with the Community Change and the Fair Immigration Reform Movement. And I'm wondering, with your perspective, organizations, has the conversation of restorative practice come up and how that's functioning within the prison system? And is there any kind of advocacy or policy you're pushing in regards to that?
So for Just Leadership, we're definitely leading with our mission around restorative justice and working with an organization called Common Justice in New York, because there is a restorative process of this. When we talk about restorative justice, there are three aspects. There's the encounter, the amend, and the restoration. And it not only restores both parties, but it allows the individuals to be restored within themselves. And we have to start bringing it to the table, because most victims don't want to continue to see the perpetrator in prison and be caused more harm. They actually want to know why did this person do this, and how they can forgive and heal and move on. And so we have to continue to create these circles and this safe space to do that. And, you know, for three individuals who have been incarcerated sitting on this stage, part of the process is society has forgiven us and restored us, and we have been able to be successful in our career, but it's thousands of Matthews, Pat, and DeAnnas out there that don't have these type of opportunities, and we have to be fair and just in everything we do and restore a person. When you're sentenced, there's a ceremony. The judge hits the gavel, you're carted off. When you're released, there's no ceremony.
Right.
We just release you back and say, go be successful, but all of this trauma, no one has helped restore me. So definitely restorative justice has to be key and a mission of all organizations.
I was blessed to come out of prison, hired by Chuck Colson to work at Prison Fellowship. Restorative justice is absolutely part of the fabric of Prison Fellowship. And I'd been very active in the victims' rights movement in California. I received the Victims Advocate Award from Parents of Murdered Children. It's in the interest of prosecutors to keep victims angry, but it's not in the victim's interest. And what I find is victims want all the lies and BS to stop. Say you did it, say you're sorry. And from that point on, the victims are very forward-looking. They don't want to destroy the person's life. Instead, more often, by far overwhelmingly, they'll say, how can we make sure you don't harm anybody else again? And that's very positive. You say that healing is important for both of them, but also for the community.
Wow. All right, next question. Okay, back here.
Hi, I'm Tammy Seltzer. We work with individuals, DC residents who have serious mental illness who are returning to the community. And as you know, DC residents, we don't have a prison system, so they end up in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I was happy to hear the passion about the Federal Bureau of Prisons. We've seen Inspector General reports from the Department of Justice. We've seen the Marshall Project research show that people with mental illness within the Federal Bureau of Prisons are having their diagnoses changed. They're being put in solitary when they're not supposed to. Who is going to hold the Bureau of Prisons accountable when they're under the Department of Justice, which both oversees them and runs these prisons? Is there anything happening on the national level to address those issues?
Doug Collins, the Republican sponsor of the First Step Act, his next step is mental health reform. This is something I've been active on. As a freshman legislator in the minority party with opposite party governor, I got $1 million for LA County to set up a forensic mental health facility to treat those with mental illness. They had nothing, but they shouldn't be incarcerated. They're sick. They're not bad. Now, of course, there are people that are dangerous, but most of them aren't. But by default, they've ended up in jails and prisons. This has been a passion. I'm meeting with the DA of LA, who's very good on this, Jackie Lacey. This is the next step, de-incarcerating the mentally ill, getting them treatment in the community that's frankly far cheaper, it's more humane, and it takes the burden off our jails and prisons, and they can concentrate on the traditional imprisonment rather than trying to deal with the people society's dumped on them.
We are out of time, and I wish we could go on. This has been such a great conversation. Please thank my wonderful panel, Matthew, DeAnna, and Pat. Thank you.